So hi everyone, welcome to the morning tea seminar today. So today we're delighted to have Janice Chanson with us to talk about the state of the world amphibians. Focus on her work in the second Global Amphibian Assessment. Quick introduction to of Janice. So Janice is she's a global coordinator at the Amphibian Red List Authority, and she also coordinates the Global Amphibian Assessment as part of the IUCN SSC, so that's the International Union for Conservation of Nature Species Survival Commission Amphibian Specialist Group, which looks at the extinction risk for a lot of amphibians. She's also based in Brisbane, so it's definitely great to catch up with her in Brisbane because she's working at the moment at Rewild, which is an organization that focuses on evolving nature. So she's a program lead here. And yeah, we're delighted to have her today to talk about some of her work. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land which we meet today. They will be meeting at Turban land, and the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands, and pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants, past and present, and recognize their global contributions to Australian global society. So without further ado, we welcome Janice to talk to us today. Thank you.
Thanks everyone, thanks for coming today. It is a bit cold in here, but that's okay. So yes, my name's Janice Chanson and I'm based at Rewild. There's two of us here in Australia, just myself running our Australia program. And I'm also half my time, I'm the global coordinator of the Red List Authority of the Amphibian Specialist Group. So many of you are probably familiar with the IUCN and in particular the Species Survival Commission. And within that we have specialist groups and they're the ones responsible for the Red List in working on conservation issues for amphibians. And so I'm the global coordinator of the Red List Authority, which basically means if you want to red list an amphibian, you need to come to me. I'm sort of this person that coordinates all of that to ensure that only one listing goes on the red list. So that is my role. I have a team of people that has not been doing it, all of them based in the US, which makes for some early morning calls. But yes, I've been based in Brisbane for the past 5 years. Before that, I was based for a short while in Melbourne. And then before that, I was based in Washington, DC, working for Conservation International. And before that with IUCN as well. So kind of been around a few of these global organisations, but pretty much doing the same work. It's just who's choosing to fund it at that time. And Rewild at the moment is a really big funder of a lot of IUCN programs. They're home to the amphibians, the primates, the small mammals, freshwater fish. We've got a couple other specialist groups. So they fund quite a lot, even though they're a US NGO, they do very much invest in IUCN, which is really great. And then another one of our key funders for the Global Amphibian Assessment in particular is Synchronicity Earth, who are a UK NGO. So today I'm going to talk to you about the state of the world's amphibians, and in particular looking at the results of the second Global Amphibian Assessment that we finished collecting data in June 2022, but we just published the results last year. There we go. Oh, there we go. So just a little bit about the Global Amphibian Assessment. So this is the process that we run in the Red List Authority for Amphibians to actually collect all our data. And for the GAA2 and the GAA1, we were very much looking at Red List assessments. We're now expanding to do a bit more, but at the moment it's very much been on extinction risk. And that's not just collecting the categories or things like that. We do collect all the data that you see on the Red List. So it's a cyclical initiative. We did the first one from 2001 to 2004. That's when I was living in DC. It restarted again in about 2009, truly kicked off 2012, and it was finished 2 years ago. So that one took a lot longer. Species, a lot more data to collect, better job to be honest. There's a lot more good data in there. So we assess all of the amphibians globally for that IUCN Red List. That's what we publish on. Coordinated, as I say, by my group there. and relies on the contributions of over 1,000 herpetologists from over 100 countries. So at least, I think we've got at least 50 people in Australia that have contributed over the years to it, even more, I think. And that's the case. We go to every country and get everyone's contribution. It's not something we do ourselves. And so, yeah, it's an example of really impressive international collaboration when you really bring people together. And that's what IUCN is all about. And yeah, really thinking about what is the conservation status of amphibians. What am I supposed to be going to try? There we go. So I'm sure most of you know this, but basically IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, you've got the 5 criteria, one that looks at population reduction, restricted range, small population size and decline, very small restricted population, quantitative analysis. Whatever data you have, you put it through the quantitative thresholds and you come out with your various categories. Back in 1996, when they did the red list, it was just species name and the category, and that was it. These days, it's actually a very comprehensive listing, and each listing is actually considered a journal article. So the key results of the GEA2. So we had 8,011 species that we assessed. We completed it June 2022, and then all of these were finally published in December 2023 on the red list. So you can see them all on redlist.org these days. So sobering statistics, 41% of threatened amphibians at the moment. So 41% of amphibians are threatened. Really, really high number, quite a harrowing statistic. So that equates to 2,873 listed as critically endangered or not. In particular, salamanders, 2 in 3, I think it's about 64%, which is a lot more than the frogs. In saying that, we have about 600 or so salamanders. The vast majority of amphibians are frogs. In Australia, we only have frogs. So we have about 7,000 frogs in the world, about 600 or so salamanders, and then these crazy Sicilians, which you may or may not be familiar with, that we don't have here in Australia either. We're a bit corporate in terms of orders. We just have the frogs. But yeah, 2 in 3 are the salamanders, and in particular, something to note with salamanders, on average, their range size is about a quarter of that of frogs, so that particularly makes them vulnerable. And this is another really sobering one. We have 37 extinct amphibians these days listed, 5 of which are in Australia, fortunately, but we have another 185 that are possibly extinct. And what we mean by possibly extinct is right now, if I asked you to go and find them, no one knows where to go because they don't know of any extant population. But they haven't done all the exhaustive surveys to confirm it's extinct, which is what you need to do to declare something extinct. We don't want things going into extinct and coming back out. So it needs to be quite exhaustive evidence to declare something extinct. But right now we have 185 it quite possibly is. We don't know where any individuals are in the wild. We still need to do support checks. So that's a huge number, and very disturbing to think we could have as many as this just in the last few decades. So how do we compare amongst other vertebrate groups? These ones here. So we are the highest of any vertebrate groups compared to sharks, rays and chimeras, 37%, mammals 27%, birds 13%, and that's, you know, they've given that a good nudge. They don't like to be the lowest, I think. And reptiles 21%. I mean, some good. And then compared to corals, 36, conifers, 34, cycads obviously very high. And these are the groups that have been comprehensively assessed. So that means we've actually assessed all the species in that group. That's that comparison. So yes, unfortunately for amphibians, they're more threatened than birds, mammals, or reptiles. So this is where they occur. It's really quite fascinating compared to mammals, which really cover quite a lot of the world's surface. The amphibians, looking at just threatened species, they're really quite concentrated. And you can see here in Australia, we're definitely down the east coast. We've got up here, down the southwest, Tassie. We're getting spared pretty much. We have amphibians out here, but they're usually quite widespread. Well, they are widespread, so they're least concerned, a lot of them. They're not seeing a lot of threats either. But we've got our real hotspots, particularly in the Andes and through Meso and the Caribbean, and that's very much been led by the disease outbreaks of the last few decades. And then China, a lot of it's driven by exploitation as well as habitat loss. And then here in the Western Ghats of India and Sri Lanka as well, and Madagascar is where you're really seeing a lot of habitat loss. So yeah, I think it's always quite fascinating with amphibians, just how focused where they occur. Very much so because they're very much tied to tropical forests. So what are the major threats that we're looking at? Globally, this is the global trend. 93% of threatened amphibians are threatened by habitat loss. I don't think that's a very surprising statistic. Habitat loss is definitely the major threat for pretty much all the groups. What we found in this research that had emerged that wasn't in our previous one very much was climate change really coming out 29%. And this is looking at threatened species. Disease, 22%. For those of you that anything familiar with amphibians, you know about disease. It is still a major threat, but not as many species as you would necessarily think, but it's still having a massive impact. Fire, invasive species, 14%, and then overexploitation, not such a big issue for amphibians. Unless they're very cute and they're in the pet trade, or they're really big and fat, so they're quite nice to eat, in general, they don't end up it being exploited. The best thing you can be as an amphibian is just sort of small and brown, and then you're doing okay in that regard. In Australasia, of all the other regions, it's actually quite interesting. It actually lies 74% with habitat loss, and here disease is 72%. And that was the only region that really had a contrast to globally. And so not surprising, you've probably heard that disease has had a massive impact here in Australia. And 51% fire, a lot greater than 21. That's no surprise to all of us here as well. And this one here as well, invasives, 49%. So again, these are the things that we're used to here in Australia. It's not what we necessarily see globally though. And exploitation, yes, we don't tend to eat our frogs, thankfully. So just looking at breaking those down, in particular, looking at habitat loss, it's agriculture that's really driving it. And that's these are tropical forest species mostly. It's that cutting down of tropical forests for agriculture is a big issue, as well as timber and plant harvesting. This is sort of more for plantations. This is more about clearing for agriculture. We can see here climate change emerging. This hashed area is about the future threats from climate change. But you can see it's really emerging here as well. And this is disease. I'll talk about B-cell in a second. So over 77% of threatened amphibians are impacted by agriculture. So we had a publication in Nature last year about key results. And one of them we published is the Red List Index. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Red List Index. If you comprehensively assess a group, you can use those categories, use the Red List Index to basically give you it's a measure of the overall extinction risk of the group of species. If it's at 1, that means everything's less concern, it's great. Everything down at 0, everything's extinct. So it's a measure of where you are overall in your group. And so here we have amphibians lower than all the others. So as a group, they're more threatened, but it's also continuing to decline. Not particularly surprising. And then we have here the, this is the corals, no, cycads, sorry, down here. We have the corals here. So you can see the amphibian trend continuing to decline. This is where it's a little more interesting, I think. You can look at it in biogeographical realms. And this is us up in Australasia. And, you know, usually we get a really hard time in Australia, but we do really poorly. But we were buoyed by New Guinea here. So this is Australasia. And in New Guinea, most of their forests are still there. So they have very, very few threatened species. So we look like we're doing a lot better than if we probably included on our own. So yes, Australasia up there. And not surprising, the neotropics is down here. And that was a real epicenter of decline for disease, as well as obviously a lot of habitat loss going on. This is splitting it by amphibians are either direct developers, larval developers, or live birth. Only about 60 are live birth, so not many. Larval developers are what we're familiar with in Australia. They go streams, they produce tadpoles, and then they grow into frogs. That's what we know. A lot of species actually are direct developers, where they give birth to that's live young. Direct developers, they don't have a tadpole stage, so they actually developed directly, and in particular, they have declined mostly, which is surprising because the larval are more often linked to the freshwater. But in general, direct developers have a lot smaller range size than our larval developers, and that's where that's driven. And then here between our groups, don't look too much into the Sicilians. We have so few that are actually assessed because they're so poorly known. They're subterranean, very difficult to know much about them. But what we're showing here is that salamanders are way worse than the frogs. So this was the probably key thing that came out of the research. This was published in the Nature article, and most people I know say, can't make sense of that graph. So I'll try and explain it. So we did the GAA between 1980, we did it 2004. We backcast what we thought the assessment was in 1980. And in that period, species that moved, so they declined and moved into a higher category of risk. If they ended up in extinct, what was the cause? And for all of the ones that went extinct during that time, it was disease. And as you can see, the ones extinct in the wild, critically endangered, critical, they've all been driven by disease in that first period. That's when chytrid really hit hard. You can see that still chytrid, if it does impact a species, it impacts it hard. It sends it into those really threatened categories really quickly. So that's the problem with disease. Although it doesn't necessarily affect as many species, when it does, it can be extinct within a year or declines extremely rapidly. So that's still the driver there. You see habitat loss still pretty constant, but this is now what we have as an emerging trend. It is into the lower categories of threat rather than still here, but we're seeing climate change now in this most recent time period is starting to push species that were otherwise doing fine into these higher categories of threat. So we're really seeing climate change emerging, and that's what we wanted to show people. Disease has not run its course. Unfortunately, there's a new version coming out, but the climate change is where we really need to pay some attention. So this graph, this is all the species that not are threatened, but changed category. So we call them rapidly declining or deteriorating species. And we looked at what the drivers were in the first time period as opposed to now. So here in Australia, you can see that from 1980 to 2004, declines in Australia were driven primarily by disease. Not surprisingly, same in the Andes and over here as well. This is overexploitation, and the green is habitat loss. Now what we're seeing emerging is Australia, it's climate change. It's not surprising a lot of these species are being impacted, particularly by droughts. When you have these species that breed in freshwater environments, we have these extended droughts. If you're losing these freshwater environments for a couple of years, you're going to lose those species. So that's what we're really seeing here. This is the Atlantic forest, the few little patches that remain really impacted by climate change, as well as Venezuela and in the US. And to be honest, there's probably more that should be seen here, but it's also to the lack of data availability with climate change. Interestingly, disease is only just coming out, that the chytrid fungus is coming out in Africa now. It's taken till now to start seeing it. About the only region left in the world that hasn't yet seen it is New Guinea. And they have a lot of similar species to us. So it is concerning that if BD was to hit there, what might happen in New Guinea. But so far, they haven't found chytrid there. Here in Europe, we've got this new hotspot of disease. And unfortunately, we had BD, which infected mostly frogs. We've had huge declines. We've now got this new variant that is particularly targeting salamanders, and only salamanders. It doesn't impact frogs. And there's 3 localities where it's been found in Europe. It's believed to originate most likely in Asia because the Japanese salamanders aren't impacted by it, and it's starting to spread. So we've flagged quite a few of these species as they're going to decline. So they're actually listed as future declines. They've done lab studies, exposed these species to this disease. They've seen 100% mortality, so they're obviously very concerned. Salamanders mainly occur in Europe and North America, and as well as these areas of Asia, none in Africa, none in Australia. They're quite specific, as well as through here. So as salamanders are already 2/3 threatened, and only a handful of these are listed here. If we get that B cell, what it's called, over in the US, we could see massive decline. So it's a real concern. So that was what we published in Nature. We also developed this report, State of the World's Amphibians. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go through these rather than talk to them. That's a beautiful cover, beautiful amphibian taken by one of our collaborators, Sandeep Das in India. It's an amphibian from the Western Ghats of India. So yeah, beautiful photo. So what we did with our data, and this is what we commonly do, and we're encouraging this to happen more in Australia, is find what are the irreplaceable amphibian sites. Where do we have to save in order to save amphibians? And we do that using Alliance for Zero Extinction, as well as the key biodiversity areas. And so they're IUCN standards. And so what we did is went through all these different sites. Not surprisingly, you can see them here in Australia. These are only AZEs in Australia we've done, and they're only being done in the protected areas. Currently working on part of the KBA committee here in Australia, and we're trying to work out the other ones in Australia as well for amphibians. But you can see where they're popping up, and this is a real priority exercise for us. This was really interesting. Someone in our team's really good at GIS, it's not me. And she overlaid all the maps and basically said, where do we find three or more species, threatened species overlapping? Where do they occur? Where are these real primary landscapes? And when we did it, it's just here, which is really amazing that we've got one here, we've got a few spotted around. These are the areas that if we truly invest in, 71% of threatened species occurs in there and can be saved in those areas. So you can really target conservation for amphibians and make a massive impact. Particularly in this area, there's quite a few different ones in there. We've tried to break them down by sort of eco-regions as well as nationally as well to make them more manageable. But yeah, interesting that you can break it down to such a small concentrated area. So yeah, that's just sort of zooming into a little bit more detail on those. The other thing we've now looked at is the highly threatened genera. So we went through frogs and the salamanders, which are the genera that are being impacted. Because not surprisingly, it's not that, 41% of all species are threatened. Some genera, just like some regions, are particularly susceptible. And so for frogs, we have these two up here, 100%. In Australia, I put this one in here. This is our Australian ones. We have Floria, 6 species, 100% threatened. They're up mainly northern New South Wales in those areas that burnt in 2019-20 that weren't supposed to burn. And there's also heaps of habitat loss up there. The Taudactylus, we've already got, I think, 1 or 2 extinct in there as well. Leiopelma and the Mixopheles. Excuse my Latin. So 75%, 43%. But you can see globally, we have these groups that are hugely threatened. Adelocus, we have, I think there's something like 90 species of Adelocus. They're the really cute, colourful ones you get in the Andes, the little poison dart frogs, being unfortunately absolutely smashed by disease, but also quite popular in the pet trade as well. The other thing that we run at Rewild, which is quite an interesting project, is what we call the search for lost. It's actually called lost species, but we do the lost amphibians part. And essentially, Rewild defines lost species as something that hasn't been seen for at least 10 years. And it's kind of sitting there data deficient. No one knows about it. And unfortunately, and you see this on EPBC listings because they don't keep track of data deficient species, if there's not enough data, it just falls off lists and people don't look at it, and it's highly likely that it's a threatened species. So our data also feeds into our lost amphibians program. We've identified 397 lost amphibians, including 175 of our possibly extinct, and we're trying to activate searches to go out and have a look for them. The idea being that hopefully there won't be any by 2033. Sadly, I think that will mean quite a few are declared extinct, that they've looked and haven't found them. But we have had luck. We did find Jackson's climbing salamander, so Guatemala, and lost for 42 years before they rediscovered it in 2017. and they had created a reserve for it, and I hope it found, and it was. We've got this for amphibians. Rewild also runs it for other species. So last year they rediscovered, you may have seen it, Attenborough's echidna in New Guinea, that program. So they managed to get on the very last day in a tundra. So that was really cool. That was one of our most recent ones. But they're looking now presently down at Eden in New South Wales for a seahorse that's only ever been seen in bycatch. So trying to see if they can find it again. So it's a pretty cool program, our Lost Species program. So other recommendations we've put in, the thing with these results is people can look at it and go, habitat loss, 93%, let's do some protected areas. That's not going to cut it for amphibians. If we protect just their land, it's not enough. There's 53% are threatened by disease of the critically endangered, 34% of climate change. And we've seen that in Australia, all those ones that declined due to disease, they declined in national parks, whether it was up in far north Queensland, Barrington Tops or Crumbit Tops up there as well. That is not the issue here. So we don't want people to just take away that 93% habitat loss. If you don't address and the threat of disease as well as climate change, we're still going to lose those species. So we've started already GAA3, there's no rest. We started in January. We're now aiming to do 5-year cycles, so we don't have such a long time in between. So yeah, and we're encouraging population monitoring. Taxonomic research is still really big in Australia, not Australia, in amphibians in general. We have 32% of our data deficient species, which we've got 900, are listed primarily because of taxonomic issues. There's one holotype, it's lost, or it's in such bad condition, or there's still a lot of that within the amphibian taxonomy. But what is nice to sort of end out is conservation is working. So these were 4 of our examples of species that have improved. So this one has gone from critical to endangered. In Puerto Rico, we've got one in Alcatraz and then in China here. And then this one, very sadly, I have now heard is being synonymized. It was what they thought endemic to an island, but they've now decided that island population is no longer distinct. So New Zealand has gone from 4 amphibians to 3, which is very sad for them. They don't have many mammals either. So, and they do have some of our amphibians there as invasives, unfortunately. So still a success story. Like, it's not a bad thing, but it's still improved greatly on the island. But sadly, a few weeks after we published that, it got synonymized. So yeah, this is part of the problem that we're always going to face is since 2006, there's been 2,711 amphibians described. It's sort of really peaked around this sort of area. We saw a lot of people that couldn't go out in the field, so they were in the lab describing because of COVID. So we saw a bit of a peak maintained here. I just haven't updated last year's numbers. So in 2004, we assessed 5,743. We did 8,011, but by the time we published, there was about another 500 waiting for us to do. So it's a moving target. In Australia, I've probably only got 2 or 3 waiting to be added. In Madagascar, when I did the list last week, instead of 300 when we finished in 2015, we've added another 100. So it's gone to 400. And then there's other regions that they haven't even described them yet. So how are we going to move to do the GA3 and GA4 in the future? We're going to be, as I say, doing 5 years. Looking at threatened species every 5 years, non-threatened every 10, just because they're not usually the focus of conservation. And make sure we do the new species within 2 years of description. Often they're very rare species, so it's good to get them on the list as soon as possible. And this is a real key thing I'm trying to push now, is collaborate with countries to get their assessments done. Up till now, we've very much done it from our team, top-down approach. We come into countries and say, hey, we've got some funding, let's do this. And then we usually... Some countries that's great and it will still work because they don't have any opportunity for funding. In Australia, it's been a point of conflict in terms of the EPBCX said, well, what about our listings? So we really want to make it a complementary process. So we're doing that as much as possible now and begin green status of species assessments. which is a complementary process to the red list, and it looks more at the historical where the species occurs historically, where it occurs now, where it could occur with conservation. So a lot of amphibians in Australia that were critically endangered because of these rapid declines, they're no longer on the brink of extinction, so they have actually improved in status, but they're nowhere near where they previously occurred. And that's not really captured in the red list. It just looks at the extinction risk. So green status really tries to capture what it was compared to what it was historically and how it could be improved. So yeah, this is our timelines. Next one is just started and hopefully 2028 finished. We estimate 9,200, and then we estimate at least 10,000 by the time we finish GA4 in 2033. Together, we will save amphibians. Okay, so over to questions.
Thank you, Janice.
All right.
Now it's time for questions. Do you have a first question to start off with? Rich?
Thanks very much for not just the talk, but all your work. And over 35 years, it's really impressive.
I have come and gone through amphibians.
Yeah, that's really.
If I'm into reptiles and that another boat, I get drawn back to them.
I wanted to pick up on the solution stuff that you began talking about at the end. I noticed, although just from the short notes, I don't really know those cases, but are there good examples of what we can do in the face of disease and climate change, right? Because you kind of pointed out that's the actual where the game is for these highly threatened ones.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of.
We know what to do.
Yeah, there's some good research going on, particularly Australia is quite leading in the kitchen research. So there is a lot going on. There is still nothing that has been found that can be used in the field for disease. So it still is a lot about predicting where it's still going to spread and getting stuff in captivity, unfortunately. And I know, for example, the corroboree frogs here up in New South Wales, they breed a couple of thousand every year and then they put them out there and about 2 survive. They're hoping that one day some more will survive and they can breed from those ones and show some resilience. So there is some genetic research with CRISPR that some people are doing and they have had some success, but that's literally then having to get that into the population is quite difficult. And I know there's research on vaccines as well, but that means going around vaccinating frogs in the field. That's not that practical either. So it's a tough one with disease. The World Herpetology Congress is in Borneo in August, and so I'm going to that. I'm hoping to actually find out a bit more about what the current progress is with disease. But it's still a very difficult one. I know with corroboree frogs here, they're doing disease-free enclosures in the wild. So up in near Canberra, they've got some areas where they're reintroducing them where they know there's no disease, because some of our native species carry the disease but aren't impacted by it. And so they're then spreading it to our native frogs as well. So that's unfortunately a problem. So that's not an ideal long-term solution, but it's one way to get them back in the wild.
And sorry, climate adaptation or anything like that?
Climate's really difficult,
Yeah.
and the key thing with amphibians and any species really, and particularly when we do listings, is you've really got to tease out what is it about climate change that's a threat to your species. If I ever read assessments that come through that say, oh, climate change impacts the species, I'll always say, how? What is it? And here in Australia, what we're seeing particularly is we have these extended droughts. Amphibians have a generational age in maybe 3, maybe 5 years. So that if they have no breeding for 3-4 years, your massive decline and possibly extinct. So when we're seeing these droughts that are now extending and larger in area, that's a real issue. So I know there's some programs on the Murray River that they've, because of irrigation as well, let's face it, they've taken so much water out in those massive droughts. If they know it's a frog breeding area, they are doing supplementary watering during that time, knowing that if it dries out, they're going to lose the species. So really, that's when it comes down to those key biodiversity areas, knowing where they are such that you can protect them and know if there's droughts, what you need to do. So for amphibians, droughts is actually the biggest climate change impact here in Australia. Obviously fires, and there's the mortality during fires, but a lot of the problem also comes with the ash in the streams that can prevent breeding for us this season as well, a whole year. So factoring that in, not just the one event that thinking about that as well. You might need to take some into captivity, put them back in a year's time. It's a tricky one. I heard that apparently with the corroboree frogs, I think it was Zoos Victoria actually, came in and their corroboree frogs that they had up there, they actually helicoptered them out before the fire came. I'm not suggesting we do that for every species, not very practical, but yeah, it's really tricky. Venezuela was another region that we've got a lot of climate change because they have the tepuis. I don't know if you're familiar with tepuis. They're these mountains with flat tops and they have steep sides like this and a flat top. And these species only occur on one tepui. They've been isolated for tens of thousands of years. And at the moment they're doing fine, but once that habitat dries there and you're not getting rainfall, we're going on this species, that's really tough to know what to do with those because it's even some tepuis, it's very hard for people to even get up, abseil up the walls to even find these species. So it's tricky, it's really tricky, but you know, ideally we've got to stop producing carbon in the atmosphere, but the reality is even if we stopped all carbon today, there's enough in there that we're going to see a huge impact.
James Watson's online with a question. I think he's going to unmute and speak directly to the room. Do you want to go ahead, James?
Hey, James.
Hey, how you doing? Great talk. That was wonderful and just so scary as well. I think this is related to Rich's question a little bit, and that is, I think red listing is so important. It really is, and I think it's, you know, getting to understanding why things are vulnerable and their trajectory is real, you know, and which ones are about to disappear first. But is there any kind of equivalent effort on which the types of conservation actions that are being done now or not across these frog species to just try and see the conservation shortfall about what needs to happen? Because like I'm envisioning you could be a really endangered frog, critically endangered, but you've got a lot of conservation attention, so your future is pretty good versus the same, you could be a critically endangered species and literally have nothing, have no actions happening for you. So your future is far more bleak. Is there any effort to get to that, like to get to the conservation state of the world's amphibians?
Yes, it's a safe bet the majority of amphibians have very little funding. That's the advantage of being a small brown frog is that you don't get eaten and you don't get traded, but you also don't get any conservation attention. Yep. So yes, amphibians in general, we did it's coming out in the amphibian, we had the ACAP document, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but the Amphibian Specialist Group, which we come under, is coming out with a practitioner's document. And one of the things they looked at was how much funding each taxonomic group gets. And compared to mammals and birds, amphibians get about a quarter of their proposals accepted for funding compared to mammals and birds. I don't think that's new to anyone. Everyone knows Cute and Cuddly gets the money. In terms of what's being done, Amphibian Survival Alliance is who takes our data and is supposed to be running with it and doing conservation. So they are the people that should be really running with those priorities. So we work in partnership with them, as well as Amphibian Arc is the other partner that we have, and they do the captive breeding and in situ conservation. So we are sort of three groups. We do the science and advise. They're very much the practitioners, conservation on the ground, and then Amphibian Arc is the captive breeding stuff on the other arm. So there's the three organisations that work together. So in Australia, I can say that millions of dollars get spent on the corroboree frogs, and there's quite a few that get nothing. So, but you know, in saying that, what they learn from corroboree frog, when hopefully they make some breakthroughs with disease, will be applicable to hundreds of species. So it's still worthwhile research for sure. But yeah, I totally understand, get where you're coming from. Yeah.
So, next question. Yes.
In terms of obtaining the data to assess these species, like obviously that's from multiple different organisations. Do you get any like pushback in terms of people not being willing to share that data with you?
Yeah, for sure. Occasionally, especially in the first Global Amphibian Assessment, I did have a book thrown at me. So what we usually do is, and this has been the first year and the second, is our central team would collect the data that's published, and then we would go to countries and hold expert workshops, and we'd bring all the experts together and get them to review the data. if we ask people to come together and there's no data in the assessments, we don't get much out of them. We actually find what I always say is bad data is better than no data because people get a reaction to that. If you ask people to respond to a blank form, they just go, I'm not doing it. If you write something bad in there, they go, oh, I'm correcting that. And so we put out assessments, people come along to them. We usually hold 1 week workshops, they contribute their data, and then together we come up with the assessments. So I always go to workshops saying my strength is the fact I don't know any of these species because I can't bias the assessments. I go very much as a facilitator and bring in the experts. The problems we come across is not so much people sharing their data. One thing back in 2003-4, when I had the book thrown at me, it was in Brazil, and Brazil, if you had a species listed as threatened, you were no longer able to collect it scientifically. That was a government decision. And so they didn't want their species listed because it stopped them doing their research. This species hadn't been seen for 20 years, and there was one expert there that lived on that mountain. He says, I haven't seen it for 20 years and I walk in that forest every day. And then there was someone else going, oh, we don't have any idea. Really don't know. It could be data deficient. And I was like, no, seriously, of all the species we've done, this one we know a lot. This is critically endangered. Something's happened to species. Anyway, that didn't go down well, so hence the book. And we ended up, unfortunately, at the end of the first GAA, we ended up having separate listings only for Brazil. That was the country that was most contentious. We had our listings and they had their listings because of that. It then came up at the next IUCN Congress, and the recommendation was made to countries, and Brazil is a member there, that they do not use the red list to determine licensing. And so that really relieved some of that. There's still some people, you still come across it, they go, nah, climate change will be fine. Including here in Australia, I've had some amphibian people go, nah, climate change, it'll be fine, don't worry about it. So that's still something we're working with, and even disease as well. Not so much now. Brazil was very much in denial of disease back in 2004, and now we've seen a huge increase in threatened species. They've finally acknowledged that they can't see what they thought that was there. They can't keep saying it's probably there after 20 years. It really isn't there. They've lost quite a few, but they don't have the evidence of the disease. That's a thing that's really key. So many species got lost due to, I think it's disease. There's no dead individuals, because by the time they get it to being blinking out can be 3 months. And, you know, it just straight away. And so we lost a couple here in Australia in the 70s, the gastric brooding frogs, which were such unique species. You know, they swallow their eggs and then vomit up their fully formed young. It was pretty cool. Of all species to lose was such a shame. And we presume it's disease, but it's not confirmed. But now what we know about disease, it's more than likely. So there has been definitely issues with disease in the past, but I think as we're now going into round 3 of the GAA, they can see what our motives are in terms of just conservation. That's what we're here to do, is inform conservation, bring everyone together. That I don't find it a problem now, but yes, originally it was.
Yeah. Next question.
Great talk, thank you so much, and you, and not everybody knows this, but this is pretty short notice, and that was amazing for you to really do that on such short notice. I'm curious about the map that you showed early on, which had the hotspots.
Yeah.
And anytime I see a map like that, I wonder.
This one.
No, further back, that was the 3, the further back is the heat map more.
Oh, that one, yeah. That one,
Yeah. It makes me just wonder about like the general distribution, and are there areas where you're comfortable that actually the species aren't that threatened, or are there areas where we just don't know? Right, so,
Yeah.
so if you were to overlay a tropical forest map on this, where are the areas that you don't know that they are?
Yeah, so where the gaps are.
Yeah.
I would say Western Africa, for sure, there's some gaps. And a part of that is also they just haven't even been described. It's really in its infancy, herpetology there. We're working with some people here, some locals, particularly now in GA3. In the first GAA, we really couldn't find anyone in country working there. So we were working with a German university that had done some work there. Thankfully, over the past 20 years, they've been training a lot of people from West Africa who are now moved back into West Africa and starting to do some really great research, and we're working with them. But there's literally hundreds of species waiting to be described in West Africa. So if you want your name on a species, that's a good spot to go. West Africa for sure. Where else is definitely a deficit? There is literally just no amphibians there. It's too cold. Amphibians don't like the cold. So there's very, very few. Same, all three here, there's no amphibians. Very, very few three here. Madagascar still has more to discover, definitely. Melanesia, we're at 500 already. Amphibians, we've got about 250 in Australia. We've got 500 here. They're still probably doing at least 20 per year. And again, very, very little capacity locally to do that. The two most predominant taxonomists in that region are Australian. Not surprising, we're nice and close. That's Paul Oliver here at the Queensland Museum and Stephen Richards, who's at the Australian Museum these days. They're the ones most prominent there. Borneo as well would be a real area, and Myanmar. Myanmar's got very, very little research has gone into Myanmar. So those would be the key regions that I would say where there's real data gaps due to capacity. There's just real capacity issues there.
So one other question, if I may. So CBCS, we have 35 or so research labs that probably participate in some way. What requests do you have for us? What can we do to help? How can students or labs get involved if there's something that how can they assist?
Well, so I coordinate globally the amphibian assessment. How it works is we have regional coordinators. So in Australia, we have two regional coordinators, and that's Jodie Rowley at the Australian Museum and Conrad Hoskin at JCU. Jodie's been part of the GA team for over 20 years. Conrad's helped with GA2 and has really come on board now. And so they're both our ASG chairs as well as our regional coordinators. So anyone wanting to get involved in listings in Australia, I reach out to me by all means, but it's Jodie and Conrad that coordinate it now within Australia. I coordinated GA2, but they're going to coordinate for GAA3 moving forward. In saying that, I also work, I'm on the Amphibian Red List Committee. I'm also setting up an Australian specialist group. We had another meeting last week, a second one. And so what I'm trying to do is bring together everyone working in all the SSC specialist groups in Australia so that people can come to us as a group and say, I want to contribute, whether that's last week we had people from the sea cucumber group join, and the fungi group, and also everybody. And so we don't have that in Australia. Everyone very much stays in their taxonomic lane. It really needs that sort of let's all get together. So hopefully the Australian specialist group, I think there's lots of interest there. We've got almost 50 people on it right now, but we just need that formal acceptance by SSC, and that'll be a real good opportunity. So as much as I do the amphibians, I've been around IUCN for 25 years now, so I know a lot of the people doing other stuff in Australia as well as globally. So by all means get in touch and I can let you know who, because there's other global assessment processes. The Global Reptile Assessment is on its second round. Trying to work alongside them at the moment and sort of bring them onto our strategy. They're a little bit newer to this than us. They're on their second round, and a lot of people that do amphibians do reptiles too. So and then there's global trees. I know there's one for mollusks about to come to Australia. So if you're into mollusks, there's a global mollusk assessment about to hit Australia soon too. So yeah, just get in touch. I know a lot of the people put you in touch with in the IUCN world. Yeah.
We have time for one or two more questions. Go ahead.
Thank you. It was brilliant. Do you know the total budget of one GAA? How much it costs?
The costs of actually doing this. The GAA2 would have cost $2.5 million US, and GAA1 cost about $1.5 million US. Sadly, our funding has been substantially cut for GAA 3, and it's not deliberately, it's just Rewild has heavily invested in the GAA in the past 5 years in particular, and said we need to share that with others because everyone benefits from this. We're not going to be the only ones. So I've been very much told to find partners. So really exciting. They've got New Mexico Bioparks, that's Albuquerque Zoo, has come on board. And so they're now bringing in their staff members to work on it. So that's what I'm trying to do, is get international partners now to come on board so that we can share this responsibility and we don't have to fundraise for $2.5 million, because after a long time doing this, it's really hard to fundraise for amphibians. Shouldn't be, but it is. They're not cute and fuzzy. It's just how it is. It's really, really hard to find amphibian money, which it wasn't.
One last question online.
Online, yeah, from Eric Vanderdyce. He says the breakdown percentage of threatened species by genera was interesting. It potentially hides absolute numbers threatened by genus, e.g. Pristomantis, with hundreds of species, many narrow range species. If the percentage of threatened species is low, could that indicate some phylogenetic resistance to threats? That is, could there be widespread in species because they are resilient for some reason? Is anyone working on this?
I don't know. There is the EDGE program. I don't know if some of you are familiar with the EDGE species. So it's a program run by Zoological Society in London, and they basically look at the phylogenetic tree and work out ones that are very, very few in the genus and are also highly threatened, and you get funding through them. But it's looking at those ones that, because there's so few in the genus, are they particularly more vulnerable to threat? And so that that cute little one that we saw, he's the he's a flagship species. He's an EDGE species, so very few in the genus. So I'm sure there is. Do I know off the top of my head? I'm not sure, but there's definitely some genera that are particularly susceptible to those diseases. So if you're looking at those ones that like Adelopus that are 100%, they're all impacted by disease. Every single one of them went down. There are some genera that none of them are impacted by disease. They're just resilient to it. And that is, it's just, I think it's kind of just the nature of that disease that it just happens to affect the genera rather than it's got something. And as I say, some also host the disease, which is even worse, so it spreads it. We have plenty of those, and of course we know our cane toad friend. I'd love another category for threatening species rather than threatened. It's got a special mention in that one. There's another really invasive species of amphibian as well. So I'm sure there is. I can't say off the top of my head what it is, but definitely there's definite genre that are particularly impacted by disease, and that's where you're seeing those ones that are sort of 96-100% in the amphibians. They're the ones that have been smashed by disease in particular. But you do, to say another thing, there are, and Pristomantis is one of those that you, if they occur in the Andes, there's a lot of very small ranges because of the mountainous terrain as well. Amphibians on top of mountains, they don't, in general, amphibians don't disperse much. They've got very low dispersal ability, especially if they live by streams. They only move 5 meters away from the stream. So if a stream's 5 kilometers away, it may be it's another species over there because no species has hopped over there for 10,000 years or whatever. So they are very, compared to a bird, you get a lot of speciation with elevational changes as well. So that makes you get a lot of genera in those regions that you have tons and tons of species because of the terrain.
Awesome. I think that wraps up today's presentation. Thank you, Janice, for the insightful talk.
Thanks everyone for coming.